My name is Elena Running Willow Carter, and this winter I turn 99 years old. When people hear that, they usually lean closer and ask the same question. How did you live so long? Some expect a doctor's advice, others expect some rare medicine or secret diet, but the truth is simpler and older than most people imagine. It came from my mother and from the stories she told me about our tribe. You see, my mother was born on land that once belonged to our people long before highways crossed it, and cities rose from the dust. Her grandmother was part of a small native tribe that lived near the forests and rivers of what is now Oklahoma. When I was a little girl, Mama would sit beside the fire in the evenings and tell me stories about how our ancestors lived. Not stories about wars or chiefs, but stories about how they moved their bodies. She used to say something I remember even now. Our people stayed strong because they never forgot the way the body was meant to move. There were no gyms, no machines, just the earth under their feet and the sky above them. And every morning the tribe practiced 3 simple movements that had been passed down through generations. Mama told me these movements were not just exercises. They were rituals of respect for the body. She said when the tribe woke up at sunrise, the elders would gather everyone in a circle. Children, hunters, grandmothers, even the oldest members of the tribe. And together they would begin with the first movement. Mama called it greeting the earth. She said the people would stand barefoot on the ground and slowly bend their bodies toward the soil, not quickly, not like modern exercise, slowly, as if they were thanking the land for carrying them another day. When I was young, Mama taught me how to do it the same way her mother taught her. Feet planted firmly, back straight. Then a slow bend forward until your fingers touch the earth. And when you reached the ground, you stayed there for a moment, feeling the ground, breathing, remembering that the earth supports every step of your life. When I was a girl, I thought it was just a strange little family habit. But now, almost 100 years later, I realize it was the first lesson my ancestors left for me. And it was only the beginning, because the second movement my mother taught me came from the hunters of our tribe. When my mother spoke about the old days of the tribe, her voice always changed. It became softer, almost like she was walking through memories instead of just telling stories. I remember one evening very clearly. I must have been about 10 years old. Rain was tapping softly on the roof of our little house, and Mamma sat beside the stove mending one of my dresses. She looked up at me and said, "Elena, our people believe that the body must move like the animals of the land." I didn't understand what she meant then, but that night she showed me the second movement our ancestors practiced. She called it the hunter's walk. Mama explained that the hunters of the tribe had to move silently and with patience through forests and tall grass. They didn't rush. They moved slowly, carefully, staying low to the ground. So every morning, before the hunt began, they practiced a special way of walking that strengthened their legs and kept their balance steady. Mama stood up from the chair and showed me right there in our kitchen. She bent her knees slightly and lowered her body, almost like sitting halfway down in an invisible chair. Then she began taking slow, quiet steps forward. Step by step, low to the ground, controlled. She smiled when she saw my confused face. "Our hunters could walk like this for long distances," she said. "It kept their legs strong and their spirits focused." Then she told me something beautiful. Even the elders of the tribe practiced this movement, not for hunting, but for keeping their bodies alive and steady as they aged. So Mama taught me to do the same. Every morning before school, we would step outside the house and practice that slow, careful walk together. Our knees bent, our backs straight, taking 10 or 20 slow steps across the yard. When I was young, it felt silly sometimes. The neighbours probably wondered what we were doing, but Mama always reminded me, these movements are older than this town, older than these roads. They come from our people. And as the years passed, I kept that small tradition alive, even after Mama grew older, even after she was gone. Now, at 99 years old, my legs still remember that hunter's walk. Not as fast as before, not as strong, but steady. And that steadiness comes from something much older than modern exercise. But there was still one more movement Mama said was the most important of all, the one the elders of the tribe believed could keep the spirit and body connected, even in old age. The third movement my mother taught me came from the elders of the tribe. Mama used to say the elders were the true teachers of our people. They carried the memory of the tribe in their stories, their songs, and even in the way they moved their bodies. One warm evening, when I was about 12, Mama took me outside just as the sun was setting. The sky was painted orange and purple, and the air smelled like dry grass and earth. She told me that in the old days, when the tribe finished their work for the day, the elders would gather together and perform a quiet movement they called the sky reach. It wasn't about strength, it was about connection. Mama stood barefoot in the yard and lifted her arms slowly above her head. Her fingers spread wide as if she were trying to touch the sky itself. Then she took a slow breath and gently leaned her body from one side to the other, back and forth, like a tree swaying in the wind. She told me our ancestors believed that when you moved like that, you reminded your body that it belonged to both the earth and the sky. The feet stayed grounded, but the arms reached upward. Mama said the elders loved this movement because it kept their backs flexible and their breathing calm. But more importantly, it helped them quiet their minds. Life brings many worries, she told me softly, but when you reach toward the sky, you remember that your spirit is bigger than those worries. So we practice that movement together every evening. Feet planted in the grass, arms reaching slowly upward, then leaning gently side to side while breathing deeply. At the time, I didn't realize how special those evenings were. I just knew I liked standing there beside my mother while the world slowly became quiet around us. Now, almost a century later, I still do that same movement every day. My arms are not as strong as they once were. My back bends more slowly. But every time I raise my hands toward the sky, I remember my mother and the people who came long before her. And I feel like they are still with me. Those three simple movements, touching the earth, walking like the hunter, and reaching toward the sky, became part of my life for nearly 90 years. But the true secret my mother gave me was not just the movements themselves. It was the respect for the body and the traditions of our people. And that is something no age can take away. My mother believed that the body carries memory, not just the memories of our own lives, but the memories of the people who came before us. When I was a teenager, I didn't think much about those words. I was busy with school, friends, and dreams about the future, like any young girl. But Mama never stopped reminding me where I came from. Sometimes she would sit by the window in the evening and tell stories about her grandmother. who had been born much closer to the old tribal ways. She said her grandmother still spoke some of the tribe's language and remembered ceremonies that had almost disappeared by the time I was born. She used to say the land was our first teacher. Mama told me once, not books, not schools, the land. Our ancestors watched animals move. They studied the wind through the trees. They noticed how rivers curved and how birds balanced on branches. From those observations came many of the movements the tribe practiced. They believed the body should move the same way nature moves, slowly, with balance, with purpose. When I was 16, Mama began teaching me to practice the 3 movements every single day, not just once in a while. She said if I wanted to carry the strength of our ancestors into my own life, I had to make the movements part of my routine. So every morning before school, even in winter, we stepped outside. The air was often cold enough to make my cheeks sting, but Mama never skipped a day. First, we greeted the earth, slowly bending forward, touching the ground with our fingers. Then we practiced the hunter's walk across the yard, moving low and steady. Finally, we reached toward the sky as the sun began rising over the trees. Those mornings became one of the strongest memories of my youth. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. We just moved quietly together while the world slowly woke up around us. Looking back now, I realize those small routines gave me something much deeper than physical strength. They gave me a connection to my roots, a reminder that even as the world changes, the wisdom of our ancestors can still guide us. And that wisdom carried me through many difficult years that came later in life. Life has a way of testing the lessons our parents give us. When I was in my 20s, the world around me was changing quickly. Cities were growing, traditions were fading, and many people no longer spoke about the old tribal ways. For a while, I worried that the stories my mother told me would disappear. But Mama always said something that stayed with me. Traditions don't live in books, Elena. They live in people. I carried that thought with me through the years. I married a kind man named Thomas when I was 24. He wasn't from our tribe, but he respected my mother deeply. Sometimes he would watch us in the yard in the morning while Mama and I practiced our movements. One day he asked her, half smiling, "Do you really think those exercises help people live longer?" Mama looked at him with that calm expression she always had and said, "They help people live better. The longer life is just a gift that sometimes follows." Thomas never forgot that answer. As the years passed, life brought its share of difficulties. We lost crops during dry seasons. Money was tight at times. Later in life, I lost my husband too soon, and the house became very quiet. But even during the hardest seasons of my life, I never stopped practicing the movements Mama taught me. Every morning I greeted the earth. Every afternoon I walked slowly and steadily like the hunters. Every evening I reached toward the sky as the sun began to disappear. Those moments became my quiet place. When grief came, they steadied me. When worry filled my mind, they calmed my breathing. And when my body grew older and weaker, those movements kept reminding it how to stay balanced. Now, at 99 years old, I sometimes stand outside in the same way my mother once did. The world has changed so much since she first taught me those traditions. But when my feet touch the ground and my hands reach toward the sky, I feel something that has never changed. I feel the presence of my mother and the quiet strength of the people who came before her. When I reached my 70s, people began noticing that I still moved differently than many others my age, not faster, not stronger, but steadier. One morning my granddaughter Lily came to visit. She watched me through the window as I stood barefoot in the yard doing the same movements my mother had taught me decades earlier. After a few minutes, she stepped outside and said, "Grandma, you move like you're talking to the air." I smiled at her because, in a way, she was right. Our ancestors believed movement was a kind of conversation with the world around us. When we bend to the earth, we remember where we come from. When we move like the hunters, we remember patience and balance. When we reach toward the sky, we remember hope. I invited Lily to stand beside me. Her small feet pressed into the grass as I showed her the first movement. "Touch the earth slowly," I told her. She bent down quickly the way children do. I laughed gently and said, "No, not fast. The earth has waited millions of years. It doesn't need you to rush." She tried again. This time she moved slowly, just like my mother had taught me. Then we practiced the hunter's walk across the yard. Lily giggled as she tried to keep her balance with her knees bent. Finally, we raised our arms toward the sky as the morning sun warmed our faces. For a moment, we stood there quietly together. That was the moment I realized something important. These movements were not only about keeping my body strong, they were about carrying the wisdom of our people forward. Our tribe had lost many traditions over the generations, but small things, like these 3 movements, could still live on if someone remembered them. And now Lily was learning them too. I looked at her standing there beside me, her arms stretched toward the sky, and I felt the same quiet pride my mother must have felt when she first taught me. Because traditions survive in the simplest ways, not in grand ceremonies, but in small daily moments shared between generations. By the time I reached my 80s, the world around me had become very fast. People rushed everywhere. Cars, phones, screens, noise. Sometimes it felt like the quiet rhythms my mother once knew had almost disappeared. But every morning when I stepped outside, the earth still felt the same beneath my feet. And that reminded me that some things never truly change. One autumn morning when I was 83, my granddaughter Lily asked me something that stayed in my heart. "Grandma," she said, "do you think our ancestors are proud of us?" I thought about that question for a long moment. Then I told her something my mother once told me. Our ancestors are not watching to judge us. They are hoping we remember them. That is why I never stopped practicing those 3 movements. Even when my knees became stiff, even when my back bent more slowly than it used to. The movements adapted with my age. I touched the earth a little more gently. The hunter's walk became slower and shorter, and when I reached toward the sky, my arms didn't stretch quite as high as they once did. But the meaning of the movements never changed. They reminded me that my body was still part of the natural world, still connected to the earth, the air, and the people who walked this land long before I was born. Sometimes neighbors passing by would see me moving slowly in the yard and ask what kind of exercise I was doing. I would simply smile and tell them, "These are the movements my ancestors practiced in our tribe." Most people were surprised that something so simple could still be meaningful after so many generations. But that is the beauty of tradition. It doesn't need to be complicated, it only needs to be remembered. And every time I practiced those 3 movements, I felt like I was keeping a small promise to my mother. A promise that the wisdom of our people would not disappear with time. As I grew older, I began to understand something my mother had always tried to teach me, These movements were not just exercises, they were stories told through the body. Each time I bent toward the earth, I remembered the land my ancestors once walked freely. Each time I moved slowly in the hunter's walk, I remembered the patience of the people who survived by listening carefully to nature. And each time I reached toward the sky, I remembered hope, the same hope that carried our tribe through generations of change. One evening when I was about 90, Lily came to visit again. She was no longer the small girl who once laughed while trying the hunter's walk. She was a grown woman now. She stood beside me in the yard as the sun began to set, just as my mother and I had done many years before. Without saying a word, she began the first movement, slowly bending forward and touching the earth. Then she took a few careful steps in the hunter's walk. Finally, she raised her arms toward the sky. For a moment, I felt something deep in my chest. Not sadness, not even nostalgia, but gratitude, because I realized the traditions of our tribe had not disappeared after all. They were simply continuing through another generation. Lily turned to me and smiled. "Grandma," she said softly, "I think I understand now." And I knew exactly what she meant. Because some lessons cannot be fully understood when we are young. They reveal themselves slowly over a lifetime. Now I am 99 years old. When I stand outside in the early morning, the world is quieter than it used to be. Many of the people I once knew are gone. The town has changed. Roads replaced old paths, and many stories of our tribe faded into history. But some mornings, when the wind moves softly through the trees, I feel something familiar. I feel like my mother is still near, and behind her, the many generations before her. My name is Elena Willow Carter, and every day of my life I carried 3 small traditions from my ancestors. I begin by greeting the earth, slowly bending forward, touching the ground with my fingers, just as my mother once showed me in the cold mornings before school. At 99 I move slower now, but the earth is patient, it always has been. Then I take a few careful steps in the hunter's walk. My knees bend slightly, my steps quiet and steady. Not many steps now, just enough to remind my legs that they still belong to me. And finally, I lift my arms slowly toward the sky. My fingers open wide, my back stretches gently. I lean from side to side like a tree moving in the wind. This was the movement the elders of our tribe believed kept the spirit connected to the body. When I finish, I stand there for a moment and breathe. Sometimes birds are singing. Sometimes the air is still. But every morning I feel the same quiet gratitude. Because these 3 movements carried me through nearly a century of life, they carried the stories of my mother, the memory of my tribe, and the wisdom of people who lived close to the earth long before the modern world existed. If you ask me the secret to reaching 99, I cannot give you a miracle, but I can share what my mother once told me as a young girl standing barefoot in the grass. Take care of the body the way our people did. Respect the earth, move with patience, reach toward the sky, and remember where you come from. Because sometimes the oldest traditions are the ones that guide us the farthest through life.